Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Couple of Nukes. As always, I'm your host, Mr. Whiskey, and when it comes to medical incidents, and today we'll be focusing specifically on strokes, but any medical incident that leaves you in the hospital or in recovery for quite a few days, we always think that's the hardest and most challenging part. Living in the hospital, the food isn't the best food you've had in your life, unfortunately. Sometimes you don't get along with the nurses, and we've had episodes on the healthcare provider side and the importance of communication and being friendly and patient and forgiving. But, on top of that environment and getting out of there, everyone's so desperate to get out of the hospital, thinking it's the most challenging part. We fail to realize that sometimes the worst part is actually getting back home. You're home now, but you don't have nurses tending on you. You don't have the necessary equipment sometimes, and you go back home thinking everything's going to suddenly become normal, and then you still have your health issues. So, we're here today to talk about how can we set up our home? How can our caregivers set things up for us to have the best possible recovery, especially after a stroke? Things are going to be different. So, people don't realize there's so much we can do at home, especially with our mental health and our mindsets, to help get us ready to get back to as close to normal living as we can, how we can recover at home, creating an environment both physically and mentally to further that. And we are here with a man who has helped so many families do just that. And he also wrote a book, which we will get into, that is a perfect guide for that. Dr. Kenneth Monaghan, recording with us all the way from Ireland. And so it's great to have you. I thought it was also early morning, but it's evening time for you now, I believe, correct?
Yeah, it's 3 p.m. or it's between 2 and 3 p.m. But like a lot of people today, we were up early listening to the results of the elections. So I live in northwest part of Ireland, and I work as a lecturer in a university in a town about 40 minutes drive away from me. And my background is that I qualified as a physical therapist or a physiotherapist here in Ireland about 32 years ago. And I've had two careers really because the first 16 years of my life I would have specialized in sports medicine, so musculoskeletal injuries, and I would have worked with semi-professional teams, and I would have treated people for bad necks and backs and shoulders and all of those things. And then in the last 16 years, since I moved to the Northwest, since I got married, I have specialized in therapies that help people with neurology problems and especially stroke patients to recover, and mostly to be able to recover remotely in their own homes, or remote from therapists. I run a research group called the Neuroplasticity Research Group, and we've raised about $2 million in the last few years to run projects, and I really enjoy that. But I think the nub of why I'm on your show today is because over the last, I suppose, 20 years, when I spoke to stroke patients and their caregivers, an awful lot of them, in fact, the majority of them would have said that at a time, like you said a minute ago, when it should be good news that you're going home, and you should be looking forward to going home. The opposite is actually true. These people have a black cloud sitting over their heads because there's a lot of myths that are out there, and there are a lot of beliefs about the home not being a great place to recover from. And also, our caregivers probably are a little bit paralyzed because they don't have the direction and the confidence
Right.
and to kind of help people in their own homes. So that's something that I'm hugely passionate about.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how recent it is, a couple weeks ago at this point, but a couple weeks ago, we recorded with Zarina Perche, creator of Zochi, which creates games to help connect generations, and she's a caregiver, and we talked about the importance of setting up whoever you're taking care of, whether that's a family member, a friend, or whoever it may be, not just to survive, but to thrive, to have some semblance of life again where they are, using their brain and happy and able to be as independent as possible. Sometimes they're going to lose some of their independency, but setting them up to do as much as they can on their own is so important. And you mentioned neuroplasticity, which is becoming such a big word over the past few years. We've seen it really, come mainstream, and a lot of people are talking about it, whether it's rewiring the brain, or people are taking neurology courses and everything. But I just want to side pivot to the university that you work at and you lecture. Is it related to this subject, or is it an entirely different subject?
It is, well, we don't have specific physical therapy courses at the moment, but we're developing those courses. I work in courses that are called health science courses, so they're like
Okay.
stepping stone courses for people. In our education system, when I suppose high school students are 18 years of age over here, they do a final examination, which we call the leaving certificate. And if you want to get into a particular program, so an undergraduate program, you have to choose which is your favorite, and you make a list of 5 or 10 courses. And each of the courses has a points that have to be achieved to get into them. So there's a huge kind of points race that happens. And in Ireland, physical therapy courses or physiotherapy courses require you to get quite high points. I'm sure it's the same in America. So if a student, if my son, for talk's sake, didn't get into some of the bigger universities in Dublin and Cork and Galway and places, then they need to find another avenue. And the courses that I lecture on are called health science courses, and they students can do a couple of years in those courses where they do modules that teach them all different health science subjects. And they can kind of decide, do they still want to do physical therapy, or do they want to do occupational therapy or speech and language therapy? And then they can go and transfer into some of the bigger universities after that. So
Okay.
that's, so it's like a stepping stone course. But at the same time, our we have a lot of clinical research. So one of the strands is my own research group. So over the last probably 7 or 8 years, I've had probably almost 6 PhD students that have graduated, and a number of master's
Nice.
students, and all of their projects were very much based on innovative therapies that can help the brain. You mentioned a minute ago neuroplasticity, and I suppose technically neuroplasticity means that your brain changes at any moment in time. And people, you see, the problem is that, and especially for stroke patients, they don't realize this, or they hear it, the myths that, if it gets to about 6 months after you've had a stroke, that your chances of recovery are gone at that point. And of course, that's completely untrue. It's rubbish, in fact, because your brain is changing itself every moment in time. So your brain is changing as you're listening to me talking, and my brain likewise is changing, creating new brain cells, changing its function very slightly based on everything that takes place. And actually, just for your listeners, if they're interested in neuroplasticity, well, there's a real guru in the world over in America, and he's a man called Norman Doidge. So that's Norman, Doidge. And he has written 2 incredible books. The first one he wrote was called The Brain That Changes Itself. And that is a fantastic book for anybody that needs hope and inspiration, and
Mm.
wants to look at some of the innovative things that are being created. And that when I read that book, that really was the template, I'd say, and the starting point for me developing a lot of the research projects, because we based a lot of them on some of the things that he was doing there.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really, really good. But for stroke patients, so the first message, I suppose, for people listening, and for caregivers is, your stroke patient and your loved one needs to understand that your brain has the ability to recover any time after a stroke. It's not within a defined period of time. It's with any time at all. But of course, you have to kind of use techniques. You have to have yourself motivated and very positive, and there's a lot of things around that that help you. But that one thing has to be understood. And if your stroke person doesn't know that, then you as a caregiver, it's one of those brilliant talents that you possess. You can explain that to them in a very easy to understand way.
Yeah, so ladies and gentlemen, if you want to change your brain and improve it, you should subscribe to my show so you get every episode. But yeah, shameless plug there. But no, I agree. I think people get caught up in this. I can't change, and scientifically, I mean, it's just proven that your brain does change. And And it could change for the worse if you neglect it. Just like any part of your health, you can let it deteriorate. And it's so important that you continue to pursue, knowledge and education and trying new things to help your brain grow. But, we're talking about education and health science and all of that. What got you initially into sports medicine and helping people recover? Was that something you were always passionate about, or what made that career choice for you?
I initially the sports thing was natural because I played sports when I was younger. And I would have, had injuries, and I probably saw myself being treated and thought that that might be a nice career. I mean, I like working with people as well, and I always did. And it's very rewarding to help people to recover, whether it's sports injuries or whether it's neurology. But probably about around that time that I started to really become interested in neurology. And after I had moved to where I live now, I'd been asked to come and see a physician. Here we call them a general practitioner or a GP,
Okay.
but in America it's a physician who had just returned home after having a stroke himself. And it's you talk sometimes about things that are fated for you. So I was moved down to the northwest. I was between jobs, and I had this huge interest. I'd heard about a therapy called mirror therapy, which had really sparked some interest in me. And then I was being asked to go and see Frank. So Dr. Frank McCurtain was the man's name. And when I went to see him, he was just typical of so many patients I've seen over the last 15 years. He had just returned home from hospital. He was completely frustrated because he
Right.
had ideas in his head about maybe how his therapy could be going or what he might do to kind of help him recover, but nobody would give him the permission to really, do or make decisions on that. They were keeping him, they were afraid that he would do harm, of course. So to be able to go in there number one, and say to him, look at Frank, you're going to get a better recovery if you become very active in terms of deciding what therapies work for you and what don't. At this point, I would say to your listeners that every person who's had a stroke looks for the golden ticket therapy that's going to get them better. Isn't that right? And you see, when
Right.
we look on the internet and we see sometimes miracle cure people, if you go on the internet, you'll find people who recover very quickly and miraculously after a stroke. And usually they'll be promoting, or the companies will be promoting the therapies that they've used. But what we have to realize, and in psychology, they call this survivorship bias. But what we have to realize is that behind that miracle cure, there's probably another 1,000 stroke patients who have a very slow and gradual recovery. And
Yeah.
that's actually the normal thing. And of
Yeah.
course, if you're sitting at home and you look at the internet and you see this miraculous patient and you compare yourself, well, then you're going to think that you're doing really poorly. Isn't that right? When actually you just need somebody to explain to you that, look, don't be focusing on what those people are using, because there isn't a golden ticket therapy at all. But what there are is there are 30 or more established therapies that are safe to use and have some evidence that they could be beneficial for you after stroke and possibly be used in your own home. And if you can manage it and if you can have help to do this, try out as many of these things. Now, in my book, I suggest 5 or 6 to start with, because they're very easy to use in your own home and they're cost effective and they're also very innovative. But when I worked with Dr. Frank that I'm mentioning, I had a chance to use the likes of mirror therapy. I had a chance to use the likes of cross education of strengthening, which is an interesting therapy, and sensory substitution. And those are the three things that our research lab would have worked on. And I saw, I suppose, that first of all, there was a need, Frank's wife, Maureen, who's the nicest person in the world, but she wanted to help in any way she could, but she just didn't needed the guidance. She needed just to be told, yeah, you do this, do that, do the other thing. And also he needed to have the license to be able to kind of choose what he wanted to do. And also, I saw that very simple, cost-effective therapies could be used very effectively in somebody's own home. And your home actually has huge, huge advantages for people that are very much underestimated. And one of those, not to go on, but one of those things which is very important to tell people who are listening is that when we're in our homes, and I have a good friend, he's Professor Ian Robertson, he's a psychologist in Trinity College Dublin, and Ian has written a book called The Winner Effect, and in it he tells us how when we're in our own homes, our bodies release substantially more testosterone, which is that rebuilding hormone that kind of strengthens our brain and strengthens our bodies, but we never realize it. And it's because we're, the sights and the sounds and the smells and the familiarity, and sometimes just even friends and neighbors coming into us, those things make an awful lot of difference. And that's just one of the huge benefits that a person gets when they're in their own home, but they don't realize it. So I suppose when I saw and worked with Dr. Frank McCurtain, and actually coincidentally, I dedicate my book to Frank because really that was the starting point for me. That was really the action from Lights Mirrors Action, and from there on, that's when I started to rebuild or to build that research group. And I suppose always, it culminated in the book being written over the last 12 months.
Yeah, so in the book title there, you had the word mirror, and you mentioned earlier mirror therapy. I mean, for those of us, I'm sure there's plenty of us who have never heard of that, or we've heard of it and we didn't know that's what it's called. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Is this something specifically for stroke survivors, or is this something that applies to a lot more patient types?
Yes, it's so you're right to ask that question because mirror therapy itself. So what mirror therapy is, Mr. Whiskey, is imagine that you have your two hands. So if you have your two hands on a desk in front of you at this moment in time,
I do.
imagine you take a mirror and you stand it vertical, but you turn it sideways, okay?
Okay.
And it's between the two hands. And if the reflective side is faced, so imagine actually that you've had a stroke, God forbid, and your
Mm-hmm.
left hand is not able to move, or your left fingers are not able to move. When you put the mirror between your two hands, have the reflective side facing your actual good hand, and
Mm.
have the non-reflective side facing the hand that can't move. And what you do is if you tilt your head very slightly, so move your body very slightly so that you can see the reflection in the mirror, and you can see the reflection of your good hand. After a very short period of time, even a few seconds, your brain is going to start to think that that reflection is your actual left hand that can't move. I mean, you're kind of fooling
Wow.
and tricking the brain,
Right.
but actually what's happening is that the visual information you get from looking at that left hand or the reflection moving, um, it sends that visual information up to your brain and it desensitizes it and it kind of creates new pathways and helps to assist with neuroplasticity. So it's a very simple therapy, and where this really was started off was not for stroke at all, but it was for a thing called phantom limb pain. So look at you've been in the Navy yourself, so I'm sure you've come across accidents where people possibly lose limbs or fingers or
For sure.
and if you lose a limb, there's going to be almost 100% chance you're going to suffer from a thing called phantom limb pain. So again, if you lost your left hand in an accident, your brain it struggles. It's kind of struggling to figure out where's all that information that normally goes up to the brain every millisecond. It's suddenly all gone, and your brain really struggles. And what happens is it manifests itself as a pain, and also, the person visualize they think they actually have a limb there. So this amazing Indian researcher back in the early 90s, he figured out that if you covered that limb, you covered the arm that didn't have the hand with the mirror in the same way that I just described for the stroke patient, and moved the good hand and look at the image in the mirror, he figured that it would desensitize the brain, and that's exactly what happened. And it was like a miraculous miracle cure for those people. So what's happened over the last 20, I suppose 15 or 20 years is people, we thought, well, this could have very practical applications for a stroke
Huh.
patient because they have the same type of deficits. And our lab has been advancing a lot of the therapy about that. But to say to your listeners that, I'm not here going to say to you that mirror therapy is the absolute therapy that will
Right,
get
of
every
course.
patient. Of course, it's not. But at the same time, last week was World Stroke Day, and of course, I was talking on a number of radio shows in Ireland, and we had a stroke survivor with us that had used mirror therapy, and he hadn't used it until at least 6 months after his stroke, where he had lost ability of his hand and fingers to move exactly like I described. And within 3 or 4 treatments, he had started to regain movement. And within 8 or 9 weeks, he had 90% of his function back. So that was a very good example. But just to show you, I mean, some people get extraordinary benefit from these things, and
Right.
some people, again, maybe
It
smaller
takes a
benefits.
while.
Yeah, exactly. But it's an interesting therapy. And the thing is, you can buy a mirror, a simple mirror for $10 or $15, and you can put it on your table and prop it
Yeah,
up
for
there.
sure.
If you go on Amazon, you can buy, there are specific mirror boxes that companies have produced. They cost a little bit more. Some of them are 40 or $50. But again, it's a therapy that's very worth exploring and trying, because some people love it. They instantly love doing it. They find it, they're easily motivated to keep doing it, and others perhaps the opposite. Yeah, interesting.
That is probably one of the most interesting recovery methods I've heard of. It's almost a placebo effect, and it's not your left hand, but your brain just, sees it. So that's pretty interesting. I think part of it is you got to be like, that's my left hand. You got to do some
Yeah.
talking to yourself for sure. But it's so interesting to think how you could just forcibly rewire your brain to say my left hand does work. It's like, but that's a whole conversation on its own, the connection between the mind and the body and what you can tell it and what you can't, right? Because you can't, it's just, it's something scientists still study every day, is the connection between our conscious and our body. And how
Yeah,
come I can't just think, all right, brain, I want you to start growing muscles on my arms because that would be helpful. But it's definitely interesting, and we've seen cases where people have really forced themselves to have dreams about working out, and they monitored it and saw the muscles flaring up about what they were thinking about. So the connection between the mind and body is so powerful. So to think that you could use a mirror just to help further that, right? Because we can think all we want, my left hand can work, but seeing is really believing in some cases. And so that's such
yeah,
an interesting thing. And to think it was originally to just pretend that you still had a hand, it's
yes.
definitely a very interesting case. And I want to
It,
talk a little bit about, or go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say to you that, what you've mentioned there about the word placebo is really really relevant to what we're talking about. And there's a placebo to everything that we do and everything that we use. So the question is there more than just a placebo to therapies? And I suppose all of the things like mirror therapy have been proven to be, because
Mm,
in our trials we would use a placebo mirror, where we would tilt the image, tilt the mirror in a way that the person definitely couldn't have availed of the image, but they don't realize we're doing it. And when you compare that, people get, definite benefits. Can I tell you a very quick story? Because you just mentioned something there about the brain and the body
for sure. Yeah.
connection. And this is a fascinating story. And there's a very famous psychologist in Stanford University called Alia Crum, Professor Alia Crum, and she has a favorite milkshake. Do you have a favorite milkshake, Mr. Whiskey?
I like all of them, to be honest. It's hard. I mean, the go-to, I guess, would be, oh, I like the mint Oreo ones because then I feel healthy, because
All
it's
right.
minty and fresh. So I'm brushing my teeth with the milkshake. So my favorite has to be the mint Oreo because it's refreshing, and it's my placebo effect that I'm being healthy. So
All right, okay.
yeah.
Well, look at Alia Crum had a favorite milkshake as well. And what she did with her favorite milkshake is she had a group of students, and she created a specially designed milkshake for them. And she told them that it was very high in calories, so high that they wouldn't need another meal for the rest of the day. And then a couple
Okay.
of days later, she made a specially designed milkshake for them. And she told them that it was very low in calories. So low, in fact, they probably would need 2 or 3 meals for the rest of the day. And as you can imagine, and I see you smiling, you realize that it was the same milkshake. But
Yeah,
what they were measuring was they were measuring how much of a hunger hormone called ghrelin was produced in their bodies for the rest of the day after they
amazing.
had what they thought was a high or low calorie. And can you imagine what happened? In the
Yeah,
people in the group that thought they were having a high calorie milkshake, they produced only 1/3 of the amount of hunger hormone in their bodies for the rest of the day compared to the other group. And that fact is extraordinary. And it's extraordinary for this reason that the only plausible explanation for that is that our brains create their brains created something physiologically based on what they thought. Isn't that right? So when they thought it was a high calorie, they produced very little hunger hormone and vice versa. And you see, this is the nub of the starting point for most people when they come home or they want to repair themselves after, after an injury, is that if you know that milkshake story and you know how important your brain is and you know that your brain acts like a pharmacy, then you know then that it's very important to have a very positive beliefs in your mind that you can get better or that you can repair yourself. Because if you do, your body, your brain will release, chemicals, growth factors, hormones to create a positive kind of an environment in your body that allows regrowth and rebuild. And the opposite is also true. When you have a very negative mindset, the opposite happens. Your body and your brain creates negative chemicals, hormones, and growth factors. And for anybody who disbelieves this, there's an extraordinary book called The Expectation Effect by a man called David Robson. And I
hmm
assure you that if have you heard of it?
I haven't, but throughout this whole episode, what I've been thinking about is expectations, and how important they
Yes,
play in a role from even before you get home, just when you're leaving the hospital, the expectations and the power of negative thoughts and positive thoughts, and just if you go into this mirror therapy just thinking this is stupid, it's not going to work, you're really going to program yourself to say, not believe in it. And belief is so important for this to work. Just like with the milkshake, if you had doubted it and been like, no, I doubt this is many calories. Who knows how the effect would have been? So I've just been thinking about expectations because they've done experiments before where they'll give you like Dr. Pepper soda, but in a Coca-Cola cup, and
yeah,
you'll be like, "This is Coca-Cola. This tastes like." And so
yeah,
it's interesting how if you don't know something and people tell you X, Y, Z, you'll believe it. Or if things are set up to make you believe something that's not, then you'll actually experience whatever it's not. We've seen it where they gave patients. I think it originally stemmed from, if I'm not mistaken, they were just giving patients a medicine, a pill. It was actually just a sugar capsule, and the
yes,
patient said, I'm healed. I'm healed."
yes.
So it's interesting. That's how it can be. You know.
You're correct. It is. And the Expectation Effect book by David Robson is full of science to back up everything we've said. And just as importantly, the opposite is true. So when you believe negative things are going to happen to you, there's a very interesting story, not to take you away or sidetrack, but there's an unbelievable story or chapter in that book that talks about a man who was diagnosed with throat cancer. And he was, this maybe September, he was told that he'd be very lucky to survive until after Christmas. As it turned out, he did survive until after Christmas. But when they did an autopsy on him, they found that he had been misdiagnosed and he didn't have throat cancer at all. There was something on his liver, something small, but it shouldn't have been the cause to make him die. And I suppose that's the opposite. If you have a negative belief, that man believed that he was going to die. So I suppose his body prepared itself. And you see, when you hear that, then if you go back a couple of hundred years now, where in tribes and there were medicine people with whale bones, and if they pointed it at you, Mr. Whiskey, and you did something bad in the tribe and pointed it at, and the culture there was that now you were finished, that makes a lot more sense now, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I think what we're finding, what I seen in my 30 years as a therapist, is that I think there's a lot more merging of the kind of, Oriental medicine, Eastern medicine and Western medicine
Yeah,
coming
yeah,
together. We're kind of taking the whole person, and we're realizing that the brain is really, really important. And your brain has beliefs and belief systems that are subconscious, and that they only come out really when we're making choices in life. And sometimes it's very hard for us to realize that. Isn't that the way things are? I was saying to my students there one of the days, just as an example of this, I said to them, think back to the last time or the first time you bought a car from a garage, and imagine yourself driving out the gate of the garage, and imagine that it's a blue Toyota car. Well, as you're driving down the road, um, immediately you spot another blue Toyota, and it's like, oh, there's my other blue Toyota. And then 2 miles further down, it's like, oh, another blue Toyota. And then suddenly there's a blue Toyota in a car park, and you see blue Toyotas because your brain has been primed and kind of ready to look for them.
yeah,
And the question is, were there blue Toyotas passing you for the few weeks before you got your car? Of course there were, but we weren't alerted to it. And you see, our beliefs is a bit like that. Our beliefs really only become kind of alerted and primed when we have to make choices in life. So that thing of priming the brain, I'm not sure if you've ever heard of that before.
yeah.
Where we kind of make suggestions to people, but subconsciously they don't realize it. Actually, there was a very good, simple experiment done about this a number of years ago with students as well, where two groups of students, one were taken into a cinema, and they were shown images of older people and oldness, if we put it like that. And then the other group were put into a cinema, and they were shown pictures of youth and young people and
Hmm.
youngness. And what they were measuring in the experiment was how fast did the people walk from the cinema afterwards? How fast did they walk down the
Wow,
corridor? And what they found was that the students who'd been subjected to images for 20 minutes on oldness, they walked substantially slower,
that's
because
insane.
it is insane. It's because they had been primed. You see, their brains
Right.
was primed. And you see, we will be doing this, I think, in the future. We'll be priming people's brains. We'll be, and you mentioned the placebo effect, but I think for years, placebo effect was a little bit of a dirty word, if we could say that. If something
Yeah,
was a
yeah, for
placebo
sure.
effect, people didn't like that. It was kind of like it was
Tricking
false.
you.
Yes, exactly. But people have to realize there's a placebo effect in addition to the true effect of medicines and things all the time happening. And we could harness that if, let's say, your doctor gave you a medicine for, blood pressure next week. And if he said or she said to you, Mr. Whiskey, before you take this tablet, I'm insisting that you watch a video that I've prepared where I tell you exactly about that tablet, and I explain to you why it will work for you, and it improves your
Mm,
understanding of it. And you have to do that before you start taking the tablet or before you do your therapy. And you see, what will happen then is you'll be primed. You'll be really thinking this tablet is going to work for me very well,
yeah, for sure.
and you'll get more benefit when you take the tablet. It's kind of like, and I think that's what could happen in the future, and it's probably the way medicine and healthcare will probably go, is that
I
we
mean, that's kind of how
formally use.
commercials work right now. I mean, right? Like, I'll use Ozempic for an example. Again, not promoting, not against necessarily, but you see all these commercials of people are living happy lives, doing great on Ozempic. So you might buy the medicine and might experience the results just because you saw in the commercial, you saw, all right, after I take Ozempic, I'm gonna move faster, do this and that. And like you said with that movie example, you might start moving faster just because you saw the people in the commercial doing it. You were primed already. And I
Yes.
think what's interesting also is we've seen a lot of cases where people actually just died from heartbreak, especially with couples who were together for a long time or family. We've seen it where someone passes away and then shortly after the other person just passes away almost mysteriously. And I wonder if it has to do with, you're saying to yourself, I can't live without them. And you keep saying that I can't live without them, and your body just shuts down because they don't have that other part. So it's definitely an interesting case
Oh,
study. But
oh, I think so. I think it's exactly that. It's again your brain. If your brain is a pharmacy, it creates chemicals, it creates things
Right.
physiologically in your body. So that makes an awful lot of sense. Actually, one of the things there you said, which is very interesting, is that, I mean, everything in life is marketing. So everything is marketed to you to kind of
Yeah.
make you want to buy it or to kind of say, to have it. And it's why medicines don't work so well in Africa and places that don't have TV and things. So,
Mm.
in Ireland, ibuprofen, the kind of marketed drug is a thing called Nurofen. Is there Nurofen in America? Anyway,
I'm not sure.
anyway, an ibuprofen is an anti-inflammatory tablet, and
Yeah,
Nurofen is
yeah.
one of the companies that sell it, and that's the well-known. So it's the branded tablet.
Oh,
And
okay.
of course, when I see Nurofen, immediately my mind thinks to the advertisement that's on television where there's a little red dot that goes up to the brain, which is supposed to animate and tell me that the
Right,
Nurofen
right,
has gone
right.
up to treat my problem. But when you go to Africa where they don't have TVs, uh, Nurofen doesn't work so well because people haven't got that placebo or that additional kind of marketed information to kind of promote the product. And it's probably why generic medicines are struggling to kind of take hold on the market as
Mm.
well. I'm sure your listeners are familiar with generic medicine. So basically, when a pharmacy or when a pharmaceutical company creates a new medicine, because it takes an awful lot of money, billions of dollars to create a new medicine, they're allowed to have a patent on it for so many years so that they get a chance to get recovered their costs. And, only for the government does that, then companies, pharmaceutical companies, it wouldn't be worth their while to create new medicines. But once the patent runs out after maybe 20 years, then all the other companies can make that medicine if they want.
Right.
And it's exactly the same medicine, but it's just called something different. And you see, it's very difficult to get a person who's been on an established branded medicine to suddenly take a different medicine because if it's called a
Right.
different name. And you can explain it to them. You can say to them, this is
People are just
exactly
so
the same.
superstitious too. People are naturally superstitious. They're like, no, I have to take this medicine. This is the only one that works for me. Or,
Yes.
this brand that people get so caught up on brands rather than the actual medicine itself. Like you're saying, it could be the same exact medicine, but they're like, no, if it's not even just like if it's not CVS brand or it's not, if I didn't get it from Walmart, whatever it may be, people get so
Yeah,
caught up on the brand, and it could be the same exact ingredients, same exact instructions to take, and everything. So people are
it
just so
is.
superstitious, and
It
people
is my
love
mom.
just having a personal connection with something.
It is. I see my mum is very exactly like this. She's been asked to take generic medicine by her doctors, and she always refuses because it's not the real thing. And the problem for healthcare systems is it costs them billions of dollars because it's going to cost extra money to buy the branded good
Yeah,
compared
yeah.
to the generic one. So that's a problem in healthcare a little bit, But yeah, you're right. All of this stuff about the brain and how your brain works, and is very important that people kind of realize this. And what's probably changed over the last 10 years or so is that the technology that we have for looking and investigating about what's happening in the brain, so the functional MRI scanners that they use, they've
Right,
become much better. So you can prove that your brain is changing at any moment in time. Whereas probably 30 years ago, you didn't have the opportunity to do that. So,
right.
the technology is kind of proving that, all of these things are taking place.
Well,
Very
and
interesting.
you and I had a chat for a while before we recorded here, and we were talking about alcohol and using it as a way to cope with social anxiety and that. And I think we see a lot of advertisements and commercials and even movies and shows promoting in mainstream media and on social media. It's not a party till you smoke some pot, or till you have, whatever it is, whether it's weed or alcohol. We see this a lot of, priming that, oh, if you have this, it's going to make you more confident and better at talking and this and that. So I think that when it comes to alcohol, it really becomes a thing where you think to yourself, hey, I'm not cool until I drink. Or you're like, if I don't drink, I think that's part of what plays into how addiction forms. You get this, you create this, thought that you need alcohol to be this person or to do that or to do this. And then you start really believing that belief to the point that your body needs it physically in order to give that output that you want. But what I think is interesting, Ken, is we talked about this mirror therapy, and I want to digitalize it. If I had the money and resources to do so, what I would do is I would create a virtual reality program where stroke survivors could put on this VR headset, and the it would make a virtual left arm that's kind of with where their arm is and moving, and kind of convince them in an even more immersive way than a mirror that they're moving and using their left arm. I think virtual technology can be leveraged to speed up stroke recovery. If anyone takes my idea, I do want a percentage of it. I can't make that. I don't own VR technology, but I think because I think the mirror therapy, I mean, is effective. We've seen it work, but if we take the 2-dimensional to the 3-dimensional, I think it'll be even more effective. And maybe not, maybe it won't be, but I think only time will tell. I think that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, well, look, first of all, you're a very innovative guy because your
Thank you.
idea is actually up and running. It's there are companies that are doing that, and actually, I had a research student a few years ago, and we were doing exactly that project. We were
Oh, okay.
using virtual reality to create, we had a software developer that created a package where when the headset went on,
Hmm.
the person could see what looked like their left hand, the damaged hand moving. Now, and so the principle or the concept of what you're saying sounds brilliant. However, can I just say one thing, and again, your listeners might find this useful, is that we always need to be careful, and I got caught out at this at an early stage with Dr. Frank McCurtain, the
Okay.
physician I talked about. Sometimes the therapies that you think people would absolutely love, like that.
Right.
They don't like so much. And where I saw this was, so I treated Frank 15 or 16 years ago when the Wii, the Wii game where you kind of hold the
Oh, like the
controller and you can
kinetic
play the game.
version. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
And there was a balance board with that, or there was a board that you could stand on. And when you moved your weights both ways, you
Oh,
could
okay.
control a ball. Or it was like golf, you can control putting a ball in a
Yeah,
hole or
yeah.
something like this on television. And when I saw that, I thought to myself, that is the thing that Frank needs because he was struggling to put the correct weight on his legs. And by coincidence, his neighbor's daughter had one of them. And this is 15 or 16 years ago in rural Ireland where we didn't have
Yeah.
all the
Right.
technology at the time. So it was
Yeah.
a very coincidental. And we arranged to bring it down and to his house. And I was so thrilled. I was so excited because I was thinking, this is going to be brilliant. And when Frank stood on top of it, oh my God, he hated it with a passion. He absolutely was like, get that thing out of here. He would have thrown it out the window. So when I say to you that people need to try different therapies, I suppose that's one of the reasons is that people get a sense, and you see also after a stroke, people will have cognitive problems that sometimes can be a little bit difficult to sense. So the thinking process that would make a person motivated or that would understand a therapy very well and that would lead to them using it very well. Sometimes that doesn't work so well. So I would say people should try all of these different technologies if they're available. And you will get a sense, and I see this with a lot of the patients I work with, you get a sense for the things that actually your gut feeling is they work well. And
Right.
here's the important thing is that stroke recovery is going to be slow and gradual, and it's going to require you to do exercises over weeks and months, which is a very unique condition. So it's motivating people, which is really the key thing that we need to do.
Yeah.
And I'm going to have to tell you another story, Mr. Whiskey. I hope you don't mind.
Yeah, that's
But
fine.
because and this is all about, how you motivate people. One way that we motivate people. So if I wanted you to keep doing therapies for a long time, one very good way to motivate you is to prove to you that you are making progress. Isn't that right?
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
and sometimes that is really, really difficult in a stroke population because For any patient at home, that's recovering, from an arm that is sore or whatever, it's very, if you make very slow progress, it's very hard for you to see that because it happens so slowly. I liken it to, our kids. We have an almost an 18-year-old and a 15-year-old in our house. But when they were younger and when they were, growing, we used to take the measurements on the wall. Isn't that right? I don't know if you ever did that in your own home. And then every month you'd take another measurement. You would
Right.
see that they had gotten a little bit taller. But if you didn't take those measurements, you would struggle to see them getting tall. And it's the
Right.
same
Right.
thing in recovery. If I have lost power in my arm and I can move my arm only a small bit up, and then next week I can move it just a little bit further, which is
Mm.
progress. But if you can't see that or if you can't measure it, then it's very hard to motivate people. But if a person, if they can prove that they've made progress by a few degrees, that is very motivational. And one of the chapters in my book talks about some very simple measurements that can be taken. And in fact, even, the use of videos or use of your smartphone to actually record somebody walking, down the corridor and then do that a week later or 2 weeks
Mm.
later, even though a lot of stroke people don't like that because it kind of makes them feel very self-conscious. But
Yeah, of course.
I would encourage yeah, a caregiver or a kind of family member to try and persuade them to let you do that, because I've seen quite a number of patients that I work with, and we record them walking down their corridor or their hallway in their house. And a week later, when you record the same thing and show them the comparison, they can they can actually see a very slight difference in their ability to walk. It becomes less bum, it becomes more fluid. And
Right.
you
Right.
want to see the smiles on their faces when they see that, or if they see a movement of an arm and then compare it a week or two later, and you can see the progress. It's a brilliant, brilliant tool. But there's another very important thing about motivation, and I have to tell you this story. Mr. Whiskey, did you ever play with Lego?
Yes. Yes. All the time.
Good, and I'm sure most of your listeners have. But there's another brilliant psychologist called Dan Ariely, that's spelled Ariely. And Dan is a psychologist in Duke University. I think it's in North Carolina.
Yeah, I was gonna say I
And
recognize his name.
yes, and he has written a brilliant book called, he has a number of books, but one of them is called Predictably Irrational, which is a great name for a book. But he does this brilliant experiment with a little Lego set. And what he's trying to, so it's a Lego set that a person would probably take 10 or 15 minutes to make. And what he wants to find out is if he gives that set to you, Mr. Whiskey, and he pays you to make the set, and if it takes you 10 or 15 minutes, and when you have the first set made and you bring it back to him, he gives you a second set, but this time he pays you a little bit less. So if he paid you $10 for the first one, he pays you $9.50 for the second one. And then
Mm.
if you do a third one, he pays you $9 and $8.50 and eight. And what he wants to find out is how long will you keep doing and making those sets before you decide that it's not worth your while, which is a very interesting question to ask.
Yeah, that's
But
for
if
sure.
but of course, there's a twist to the experiment.
Mm.
So when one group of people bring the first Lego set up to Dan, he looks at it. He looks at you and he smiles and he goes, he recognizes that you've done a good job. And he writes down in his book that you've done it. And he encourages you. He says, well done, Mr. Whiskey. You did a great job here. You can easily do more of these. He acknowledges that, you've done a good job and he praises you. He's saying you did a really good job. And more importantly, he takes the piece and he puts it on a shelf up behind him so that when you're doing your next one, you can see it. And if you're doing the
Yeah.
third one, you can see the first two. And so you've kind of got a record to look at. Now, in the other group of people that were doing this, when they brought their piece up to Dan, he looked at it and then he looked at them, but absolutely nothing. No smile, no body language, no writing in a book about it, no encouragement, no acknowledgement, no praise. In fact, what he did was, instead of putting it on a shelf, he broke it up in front of them and he put it into the Lego bin underneath the table, right? So he gave them the next set and paid them the same as the other group. And of course, as you can imagine, your group that got all of the
The
so the,
praise.
the praise, the encourage. So I call it reap. It's so if you recognize that somebody is doing good work, if you encourage them, E for encouragement, if you A, you acknowledge, and P, you praise. If you do that to somebody about their work, they did almost twice as many. twice as many because they got that feedback and that record. And you see, why I'm saying this is that in stroke rehabilitation, this principle or concept holds exactly the same. So if a caregiver or family member is working with a stroke survivor, and they're keeping a record of all the exercises they do, and you say, look at this week you're doing
Right.
10 times, next week you're doing 15, you have a record to look back on, or you've even a copy that you can say, look at all the exercise you've done over the last 6 weeks. If you encourage and you say, look, you're doing a great job. I realize it's very tough for you to do these things. I know you're struggling, but you're really doing well. And you praise people. If you do those things, people will keep going, and they get better motivation to keep going longer. And the thing is, these are very simple things to do. All you're really doing is giving a pat on the back and formally just recording what people are doing. And
Right.
to be honest with you, Mr. Whiskey, most people who are in employment, probably their managers and their leaders and their bosses probably should listen to that experiment, because it holds true, isn't it? When we
I
get
agree
praise,
100%. Yeah.
yeah, and a lot of times that doesn't happen in life. And sometimes the further up the ladder you go, sometimes people think you don't need praise at all. And I would disagree. I would say that you need just as much praise no matter what level
Yeah.
you're at, and helps people. Anyway, so interesting just in terms of motivation.
No, I agree. I think a lot of stroke survivors are going to have a lot of self-doubt, and they're not going to be able to see the results because what they're trying to see is full recovery, that miraculous case or whatever. They want to see that fast progress. So I think if they don't see fast progress, they just see no progress at all. So to show them something, I think is great to fight that self-doubt. And another thing too, I think with the stroke survivors is that if they're trying multiple different forms of recovery or therapy, it's important to keep a kind of refreshing mindset each time you go into something new because I think a lot of them get caught up in this cycle of the last thing didn't work, so this isn't going to work. And you already go into it thinking it's not going to work, where you need to say, all right, this is something new. I can't base it off of the other methods that didn't work. But I think a lot of times in life we get so caught up with frustration that the more things we try, the less effective the next one is because we're going into it with such a this isn't going to work kind of mindset. But yeah, so as far as your book, I know we've really addressed the caregivers, but is your book something the stroke survivors should read as well to kind of advocate for their own health? And I mean, sometimes we might be recovering in an environment where the people around us aren't as interested in our health. Maybe they feel burdened or they're busy and they don't want to do this research. Is this something our stroke survivors should read and say to their caregiver, hey, I want to try this or I want to try that? Would you say this is a resource for them just as much as the caregivers and their family members?
Yeah, the book was written in a very easy to understand way. So it was written for kind of non-professionals, but there's 140 footnotes of science that backs it up if people want to look it up. Um, of course, if lots of people have strokes and they're well capable of reading information, and they really want to find out. And of course, if they're able to do that, then definitely read about why neuroplasticity happens all the time, and why your home is a brilliant place to do your rehab, and why your caregiver can have special talents that really makes them very good to help you, of course. And actually, one thing that I just wanted to say, that when I was writing it, I was a little bit conscious as well that a lot of stroke patients sometimes have cognitive issues, or they have visual problems sometimes that
Right.
stops them from being able to read the book. So what I created at the end of every chapter was, in addition to obviously a takeaway message that the person can look, and they can summarize the main things. I don't know if you can see it in here, if you've seen it in the book, if I've sent it to you, but on you see there's a kind of a brain picture there.
Right.
Um,
Is that a QR
so
code in it?
Yes, so it's a QR code, where what I've done is I have a YouTube channel, more than yourself, and I've recorded videos that summarize the main stories
Mm,
and the main concepts from each chapter. And actually, so if a person can't read the book, they can just scan the QR codes and they can listen to summaries, me describing, some of the concepts and some of the stories. And I saw that this was very useful for some
for
patients that I've had
sure.
over the
Yeah.
last while. I know another person would be saying, well, why don't you just do an audio version of the book? And maybe we will at some stage. But actually, sometimes just describing the things in an easy to understand way is almost like a little summary of it as well. So a lot of people have come back and said to me they find that that's very useful. And I think that's what's happening as well. A lot of newspapers now, don't they? If they report interviews and things, they give a QR code where they can go online and you can actually see the interview taking place and things.
Yeah.
So you're right. So the book is, look, it's written for caregivers and stroke survivors if the person is capable of, actually taking
Right.
information from it. But if they're not, then I suppose you're reliant on your family member or your loved one to kind of read it and kind of and it's written so that you can kind of understand and be able to explain things in a very simplified way. And I think that's what has to happen, you see. And you see, that's the problem with care. A lot of caregivers, family members, they have this paralysis because they're not really sure what's the right information and the wrong information to tell people. They're not really sure, what would be good therapies and things to do. And they're not really sure, if they're going to cause somebody to have another stroke by doing things. So they're more inclined to do nothing than to take a chance on
Mm,
on doing stuff. So that was the point of writing the book, was that it's to kind of, you come home and you don't have that menu or that guidance. So this is that guidance. It's that information. And I would suggest people, maybe if they know they're going to be discharged home in 1 or 2 weeks, that's probably the time to start maybe a little bit of information, you
right.
know, get the brain primed, start off by really reassuring them that neuroplasticity takes place at any time and can happen. Going home has to be seen as a positive move, not a negative one.
Right.
Just because you're leaving that rehabilitation center, and you don't have big fancy equipment in your own home, that does not mean that you can't make a recovery. And I've given 5 or 6 therapies that are very easy to do. We discussed mirror therapy a minute ago, but actually there's one other very interesting therapy which has huge potential. Is a very simple thing, Mr. Whiskey. It's called cross education of strengthening, and very
Yeah.
simply put, it's imagine you went to the gym yourself for 6 weeks and you just strengthened the right side of your body. Now
Mm,
you'd never do that in practice because people strengthen both sides, isn't that right?
right. Right.
But actually, if you did and you measured the right side of your body after 6 weeks, it would be very, very strong, as you can imagine. But amazingly, if you measure the left side of your body, it can be anywhere up to 40% stronger, even though you haven't done anything. And the reason for that is that, unbeknownst to us, the electricity or the neural activity in our brain, it crosses across to the other side when we're doing unilateral movements. So the other side is actually getting stimulated, even though you don't realize it. And as you can imagine, that would have a brilliant benefit, or potentially could be very useful for somebody who can't move one side of their body.
Wow.
And and you see, in our research group and in our neuroplasticity research group, what we've been specializing in is kind of combining therapies. So in my book, I suggest how people can use therapies individually, but actually in our group, we've developed technology and medical devices that incorporate, say, mirror therapy and strengthening at the same time. So people can kind of double up the therapies. And maybe potentially down the line, we have some patents on some of these devices. Maybe those will become wholesale use for some people. But at the same time, you can buy a piece of resistance band for $5 or $10, and you can attach it to a
Yeah.
door in a
Mm,
very specific way, and you can actually do exercises that can be hugely beneficial as well. So all of these things can be done at home, and that was really what I wanted people to know, is that you can do therapy at home. You can kind of try things. You can have the flexibility in your own home to do therapy when it suits you, according to your fatigue and your tiredness and all the things things that happen. And sometimes that isn't allowed when you're in a traditional rehabilitation center, because a lot of times the therapies are timed and you go at a certain time. And sometimes when
Yeah.
you wake up after a stroke, in the morning, you might just be really, really, really tired and fatigued that day. So the ability to have flexibility around your timetables, and the ability to do as much therapy as you want, and as you can motivate yourself to do, that's really what all of the stroke associations are advocating nowadays. They're saying that, look, at the people who make the best recoveries are the ones that kind of adhere to that, the 10,000 hours principle, where, if you want
Mm,
to be an expert in something and you do
yeah.
10,000 hours, you can get there. So I kind of I liken to that by saying, look, at 10,000 repetitions is kind of like the concept. If you can kind of push yourself to do lots and lots and lots of repetitive exercises of therapies that you decide work well for you, then you give yourself the best chance of a recovery, regardless of what length of time it is since a stroke. And that's really what you're trying as a family member or loved one. You're trying to kind of really incorporate that, and convince your stroke person that that's what's happening. And sometimes if you have a book or you have a piece of information and you can show it to them, it's a good validation that that takes place.
Yeah, I think the most important thing, ladies and gentlemen, to take away from this episode is it's one of hope. And kind of like we've said in other episodes, we live in a day and an age where there is so much information out there. Now, be careful because there's a lot of false information out there. Like we said earlier, there's our myths, misleading information. But we live in a day and age where there's so much information out there. And in fact, it is probably the best time to have a stroke if you're going to have one. I hope that none of you listening ever have a stroke. But I say that in the sense that there are more recovery methods, especially at home, in effective but cheap methods, more than ever before. So you should be hopeful in the sense that there is so much out there for you to try, and that includes Ken's book. So we'll have that in the description below. It's a ultimate guide to stroke recovery for at home. So whether you're a stroke survivor or a caregiver, or you're just someone who wants to be prepared and learn more information, definitely be sure to check that out. We're going to have that in the description below with his website, which has a ton of useful information on it as well. But Ken, before we close off this episode, I have to ask you a question that's been bothering me from the beginning, which was, Ken, what is your favorite milkshake? I didn't want to interrupt your story, but you asked me and I wanted to ask back, but you started talking about the super calorie milkshakes, and I didn't want to interrupt you, but it's been bothering me this whole time. Like, do they have
Uh,
milkshakes in Ireland? I have to know.
oh, they do.
Do they
They
have not?
definitely do.
Sorry, do they have non-alcoholic milkshakes in Ireland? Is the better question.
Yes, they do. So look, it'll be something with strawberries, pineapples, mangoes,
Oh,
probably some sort of yogurt, something like that would be my favorite, I'd say.
I
I'm
don't know
not
if
a
that's a
mint. I'm
milkshake.
not a
Sounds
mint
like a
chocolate.
smoothie.
Yeah.
It's more of a smoothie. You got all pieces of fruit in there and yogurt and everything. That sounds. I
Yeah.
thought
Well,
mine was healthy. I thought mine being mint was healthy, but you have me beat in that category.
yeah, I think that'd be the flavor it would be. Um, Look, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I wonder, just before I finish, would it be very sensible for your listeners if I just very quickly ran through the alert signs for people, that to be on the lookout in
I
case
think that
somebody
would be
would actually
great.
have a stroke? Would that be important? Because World Stroke Day was last week. So the timing of this podcast is actually very good because World Stroke Day was last week. So for your listeners, the acronym is Be Fast, so BEFAST. So B, so if these things ever happen to you all of a sudden, so B stands for, that your balance becomes affected or you become disoriented, or, maybe you have a very, very, very severe headache that somebody might describe as the worst headache they've ever had in their lives.
Mm.
E stands for eyes. So if your vision was affected in one or both eyes, all of a sudden, that's a kind of a bit of a warning sign. F is for your face, so that if your face, one side of your face kind of starts to droop or sag, or you find that there's a weakness or drooling that happens there. A stands for your arms. So a weakness in one of your arms that happens all of a sudden. So if you try to, lift your two two arms, you find that you just couldn't lift one of them. That is something that is concerning. S would stand for speech, so that your speech becomes slurred, and you cannot talking correctly. And then T actually stands for time. If you notice one or more of those things happening to you in all of a sudden very quickly, then T, it's time that you should dial 911 and check those things out, because even hopefully nothing like that is happening, it's probably best to err on the side of caution for that. Is that okay?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I do want everyone to know I'm half Irish, by the way. So I'm not
Oh,
just
good.
dogging on Ireland. I am half Irish. I wasn't born there. I haven't been there, but I just want to say, yeah. But
Yeah, you'll have
I
to
think
come over sometime, I think. That's what you'll have to do.
it's on my list. I recently recorded with Tom Equals, and his book he wrote, a Vietnam book about horsemanship, was a lot of it took place in Ireland, and I was like, I gotta go visit sometime. I've got some ancestral roots over there, and I think I should definitely go check it out. It's on my list. Italy and Ireland. I'm half Italian, half Irish, so gotta go hit both of those up. Very different cultures in some aspects, but I'll go. I don't know if it'll be better to drink in Ireland and then, chill out with wine in Italy, or maybe set up myself with some wine in Italy and then go crazy in Ireland. But
I,
yeah,
I
but
was I was saying to you just before we started the podcast that I actually worked in America. I worked in Florida,
right.
close to Fort Lauderdale area for 4 years when I was a young physical
Fort
therapist.
Lickerdale. That's what we
Oh,
called it
is
in the
it?
Navy. Fort Lickerdale.
Oh, is it
So
okay? And that was a fantastic experience where I came across some of the best therapists I've ever met in my life, I have to say. And I would have worked in rehabilitation centers, and that probably was a big help to me as well. Kind of the more things you see. So when you talk about going to Ireland and Italy and things, the more things you
yeah.
experience make you a better um, analyzer of information, and become more strategic in your thinking and all of that thing. So yeah, definitely come. And if you're coming to Ireland, you have to let me know. Is that all right? And we'll try and meet you. But it might be coffee if it's me. I'm afraid I'm not a drinker
We're
anymore.
gonna have to get milkshakes. I think we're gonna have to get milkshakes and do a little photo shoot and do like,
Yeah, I
yeah,
think so.
you're drinking a smoothie at that point, Ken. I hate to call
Okay,
you out,
right.
but I mean, if what you described was not a milkshake, it's not a
Okay,
milkshake
right.
kind of drink,
Okay.
not by American standards. Yeah. So, but
Okay, look, come here. Thank you very much. It's been fantastic.
oh yeah, no, this has been a great episode. I really appreciate our conversation. I think we touched upon so much more than just strokes, but also just health in general. And so, if you're not a stroke survivor or caregiver, I think some of the things we talked about are universal when it comes to your mindset really affects your body. I think the neuroplasticity is so important to know that your brain is ever changing. It's never too late to learn something new or to try and fix something that's going on with you. And I think, as we mentioned earlier, both as a caregiver and as a patient, with yourself, you need to be patient, forgiving, and you need to understand that recovery takes time and that it's the small victories that really matter and add up. So, Dr. Kenneth Monaghan, I really appreciate you coming on the show, and I look forward to connecting with you in the future. But thank you once again.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Sailing through the ocean blue, nuclear reactors my crew, guiding the ship, the stars as our guide, through the waves we ride. Jokes and laughter fill the air, on this voyage we have to share, working together, side by side, as one family we will abide. In the heart of a ship we reside, nuclear operators with pride, powering the vessel with every stride. Our mission, a source of great pride.